when they actually spend their time listening to this show. What does it mean? It means we're winning.
I'm white, and I've got everything I need. No one clutches their purses when they're in a room alone with me. And I can drive for any neighborhood I please at any hour, and the police don't do a thing. So if I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I got everything I need. I'm a guy getting paid more than a girl with a degree. And I can walk down the streets after dark, no one wants to rape me. And I can get a girl pregnant and just as easily flee. Just like my straight white male dad did to me. So if I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need. I've got a pile of broken mirrors and I'm walking under ladders and I'm spilling tons of salt, but to me that doesn't matter, cause my skin and my gender and my orientation are the best things to have if you live in this nation. I recommend it highly. If I see a penny on the ground, I leave it alone and fucking flip it. I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need. Shit's gonna work out for me, cause I'm a straight white male in America. I've got all the luck I need.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Intellectual Dollar Tree. We do the show live on Twitch every Wednesday, 7 p.m. Pacific. Till, I don't know, fucking like 8:30 or whatever, and then we go into the post game. That usually goes pretty late. Flying solo tonight. HK Perrin had a lot of adventures today and is pretty tired. He'll be back with us next week, though, of course. You can support this project at patreon.com/Echoplex. You can throw bits at us on Twitch, as Professor QAnon is doing right now. You can also subscribe to this channel here on Twitch, or you can go to our website, echoplexmedia.com/support. Find other ways to support us, including our swag shop, which I really, really need to update. So if anybody saw on Twitter today, we're going to be doing, this will be the Friends of Epstein episode. We got Steven Pinker and Lawrence Krauss talking about rationality, psychology, language, and more, but not Jeff Epstein.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. It's been a while since we've been together, but I find it's never failing to me that whenever I spend time with you, I'm enlightened. So thanks.
Thank you, Lawrence. Good to be here.
Good. And, I want to... it's quite clear that what I want to do is talk about your new book, and that's probably what you're most excited about. But it is the Origins podcast, and I want to talk about, in some sense, how you got there and where you came from, and I want to begin at the beginning. You and I have already talked about the fact that we have a variety of kind of parallelisms. You're only 4 months younger than me, it turns out.
What else do you have in common?
Grew up in Canada to Jewish parents, and both moved to Boston to graduate school, and then moved back and forth between MIT and Harvard, although in opposite directions. But that's as I think about it, that's about as much of a parallel as there is. You grew up in Montreal. I grew up in Toronto, and one thing that I never asked you, it occurred to me, is your interest in language. Does it stem at all from the fact that you're from English parents in a province that was French, and the need to sort of try and speak two languages? Did that impact on you at all when you were younger?
That would be a good story, but it's not really true. So.
I didn't know if it was, but I just wondered. Yeah. I mean, you were
probably the closest. The only connection might be that in McGill University, being in a bilingual city, had the way that many departments will specialize in areas that are locally relevant. They had a pretty strong program in psycholinguistics, and linguistics and psycholinguistics were big at McGill when I was an undergraduate. I think that's the closest, especially since my interest in language was not so much from practical problems in.
He left that little brain on Epstein's island.
Are there any advantages to being bilingual? But really more deeper questions like, what is language? How did it evolve? How does it work? How do kids acquire it? And I came to language just in my autobiography, really from reading a long-form article in
Wait, this guy's like in his 50s. What kind of fucking like ego do you have to write an autobiography in your 50s?
Times magazine in, I think it may have been 72, on this young upstart in linguistics named Noam Chomsky, who had turned the field upside down, was part of the cognitive revolution, helping to overthrow behaviorism as the reigning philosophy of psychology. Yeah. This being the doctrine that any reference to mental constructs, thoughts, beliefs, rules, plans, images, memories was unscientific because they can't be measured, and science is only about things you can measure. Yeah. And so science of behavior, first of all, psychology should be a science of behavior, not a science of mind, because the mind is superstition, like leprechauns or fairies. You can't, how can you measure a mind with? I have a feeling
he's like, butchering Chomsky pretty bad.
Concentrate on
just a guess, though,
between the current stimulus situation of an organism, which you can measure with instruments, its history of learning, and then you measure the responses. So that was kind of what dominated psychology in the middle decades of the 20th century. And then this article pointed out how Chomsky was one of those who overturned that paradigm, and the mind was a respectable thing to study scientifically again. I think it was that article plus books around the home and exposure to cognitive psychology in college and then university. It just seemed tremendously exciting that you could actually study the human mind scientifically.
Yeah, well, it is. I
mean, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, right? So maybe I'm wrong, but isn't it yes and? Instead of one or the other, it's got to be yes and. It's got to be, you can study psychology by observing behavior, and you can study psychology by observing like the physicality of the brain. Like, I think that it has to be both. I couldn't imagine it not being both.
I was fascinated when I was younger. There's another difference between my life and yours. Your parents were professionals, so I wanted to be a neurosurgeon because I figured that's as close as you could get to the mind. I didn't know there was anything else. But your father was a lawyer, and your mother was a. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so my father was trained as a lawyer, and he actually stopped practicing pretty early in his career. He resumed it in midlife, and in our generation, the boomers, the yuppies, it's almost inconceivable that if you had a law degree that you would go into business instead. But my father sold. He sold women's clothing. He was a traveling salesman. He sold tennis dresses and lingerie and these items that I don't think anyone has.
Whoa! I wonder what Pinker's dad's body count is.
Would wear in the '60s.
Yeah.
And I for me, like, he had a law degree. Why did he sell house coats? And the answer was it was it was a way to make a living. And in his generation, children of immigrants, the professional degrees and being a professional just wasn't a thing. It was, if you were a mensch and if you could make a living and support your family, it didn't really matter what you did, in the prestige of being a lawyer versus a salesman just didn't register with them. Yeah. And I think, then in our generation, the thing was you got to get your MBA or your doctorate or whatever.
Well, mine was doctor or lawyer. MBA or doctorate was just too academic. It was my brother a lawyer, me a doctor. That's what my mother wanted.
Oh, same with me. But so then I think when my father got into his 50s, he was sick of schlepping around the province of Quebec with sample bags full of clothing, and he did. He reopened. He renewed his law license and then opened a practice late in life. Even then, it was a kind of thing he did on the side, but he was more, again, in that generation,
Yeah.
kind of entrepreneurial, business oriented, not particularly impressive.
Maybe one of the things that makes me a bad interviewer, or maybe it makes me a good interviewer, is like when somebody comes on, I don't want to hear their fucking personal story. Like I want to hear what they have to say about the world around us. I like don't care about this stuff. I find this stuff painfully boring. Like at a cocktail party or in an interview or whatever, like talking, like, I don't know, maybe I'm just cold or not a people person or whatever, but I find this stuff, this part of this is just so painfully boring to me and does not interest me at all.
By professionals. He was mainly a kind of a landlord. He had some rental properties. And so I consider my background not so professional, more small business. And I had another uncle who had a law degree again.
Wait a minute. What, your background professional? Small business that's not professional? What is he talking about?
Instead of practicing, he went into his father-in-law's auto parts business. My other uncle got an engineering degree, but he went into his father's business making neckties.
Wow.
This was I think the values of that, the first native-born generation of Jewish immigrants.
Yeah,
it was. Can you make a living? Can you support your family?
That was it. Yeah, that's exactly right. And for me, I guess they wanted the next generation to be professionals because they thought it might make a better living. At least my mother thought that. It's interesting. My father sold shoes, so we're closer than
I think we are. I think we're actually we're very close. And indeed, my mother said early on, she said, "Why would you go into psychology? Go into psychiatry." And then, you don't have to be at the mercy of the academic job market. You can do everything that a psychologist does, but more. And besides, isn't psychology, isn't that just cats and rats? Which it actually was in her generation, because she was a student during the behaviorist reign. She said, "You don't want to go into psychology; it's cats and rats."
Well, she had a college degree. She was eventually
a college degree.
Vice principal. What was her degree? What was her background in?
She had a degree. She then became in the 50s. She did what everyone did: is she had children, moved to the suburbs.
That's not what everyone did in the 50s.
Did not work.
That's incorrect.
As a child. Mm-hmm. Then and again, like that generation, got restless when her kids started to be teenagers, when the feminist revolution happened, and so she then went back to school, got a master's degree in counseling, became a high school guidance counselor, and then the vice principal of a high school. And for many in fact, it's funny, she has many generations of her students are people I meet in all walks of life.
Oh, that's nice.
Last night I gave a guest lecture at a course in Harvard. The instructor said, "Well, your mother probably doesn't remember me." But
yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I bet, but what she said to you is I remember when I got my first job at Harvard, my mother called my wife at the time and said he can still go to medical school. What does he want to get chalk on his hands for? For me, with the idea of physics was somehow sitting at a blackboard and getting your chalk on your hands. So
we're actually we're really from very similar backgrounds.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe one of the reasons that we relate. At least I certainly enjoy you so much. Yeah. But in terms of, did either of them encourage you? You had interest early on in psychology, I guess. In terms of sort of being a quote unquote scientist, did either of them have a stronger influence on you, or they just let you go in whatever direction you wanted?
I probably had more. My mother had more of an interest, more of an influence on me. She herself, when she was a master's student in counseling, I at the same time was an undergraduate in psychology. We actually were at McGill at the same time. We would sometimes commute in together, and we would often read. Both of us read in psychology, and Piaget and cognitive behavior therapy. Mm-hmm. So our interests overlapped. Of my parents, both very smart, but my mother was more of a reader, more of a more intellectual of the two. Mm. And so I
kind of wish this would have been separated out into segments so we could have skipped the niceties part and got to the meat of this, but it wasn't separated out into segments, and I didn't have time to listen through this today.
And she commented on a draft, as she does with most of my books, largely because I kind of think of my reader as similar to her, someone who's not very smart, but not an academic, intellectually curious. And I suspect this is true of you as well. I treat my readers as equals, but people who just don't know what I happen to know. And I'm trying to
exactly.
show them things that they can see with their own eyes, granting them the respect of being curious and willing to put a little bit of mental work in. And my part of the bargain is that if my readers are willing to put a little bit of mental effort in, then I will reward them with a real understanding. They shouldn't be puzzled after putting some thought into it. I try not to leave stuff out or to make assumptions
or appeal to authority or
appeal to authority. Yeah. So it's exactly. So it's for something like Bayesian reasoning, the theorem of the Reverend Thomas Bayes,
which we'll get to. Which is fascinating. Change
people,
science.
Sometimes that may seem intimidating. Oh my God, a theorem.
Yeah.
It's got 3 terms in it, so it's not that not that complicated. You do really have to give a little bit of thought to it. But I felt that it is something that any intelligent person who's willing to think a little bit can grasp. And in fact, one of the arguments I make in the book is that in some domains we already are Bayesian, even though we don't think in terms of the algebraic formula of the theorem, but our intuition is Bayesian.
In certain ways, and in certain ways, as you also point out, it's Bayesian, but not Bayesian, because the priors are often things we want to be true rather than are true. And we'll get to Bayesian. Well, Bayes has changed in my own field of physics. It changed everything. And I even though I've used it, I still have to always go back and kind of remember its basis every time I think about it. And that's why I was so pleased that you actually did that. I
was trying to think of a way to express what I'm thinking about what Pinker's saying, but he's basically saying that if you're smart and you think about it a little bit, you'll realize that my work is brilliant and you'll come out of it with a greater understanding. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's why people write books, like people who are science communicators or whatever write books for a lay audience, but I've never heard anybody put it quite the way that he put it. It's pretty kind of it's just a little bit delusional. I don't know. I think a lot of these people have delusions of grandeur.
And Steven Weinberg used to say in his first book, you may remember the first 3 minutes, he said his reader he thought of as a lawyer, and a cunning lawyer, someone who didn't have a background in science, but was going to question the arguments and put work in. And I think that's the idea. If you can, if people are willing to work through it, then they should. I mean, they may not have a mastery, but at least an understanding. And I find that to be a wonderful characteristic of your books. And I think that's the best you can do. And it's a shame that it's interesting to me. Well, I wasn't going to go in this direction, but we've both written a lot of books, and I'm always amazed that somehow. Maybe psychology is less intimidating than physics, probably because
I think that's an understatement.
Well, for me, it's funny because for me, I think I did as I will talk about, do physics because it's easier than neuroscience. But the notion that you should be willing to puzzle through in something like physics is something that reviewers in major magazines that's not they're willing to puzzle through in psychology or maybe history, economics. But in physics, they'd just rather say it blew my mind, so I think in psychology it's important to present those puzzles, and you do actually begin the book with puzzles, which is a wonderful thing. I have to say the book was quite different than I expected, but I'm not quite there yet. I want to talk about how you got there, and I promise within the next 7 minutes we're going to get to the book because I know we have so much to talk about in so little time. I wish I had 3 times the time to talk to you now. One thing I did, there's some puzzles about you though that still.
What are they super busy?
First, your PhD was in experimental psychology in vision, right? Is that right? Okay. First of all,
visual cognition,
3D versus
mental imagery. Yeah.
And one thing I was going to ask is, since Chomsky had changed, well, one thing that occurred to me when you were talking, since Chomsky had been in some sense kindled your imagination about the psychology and the innate cognition instead of behaviorism, you chose to go to Harvard rather than MIT. Was that and Chomsky was at MIT? Was that
well, he's also in a different department. He's not. Yeah. He's a linguist.
Yeah. So
I absolutely wanted to be a psychologist. Linguists. It's a different field.
Sure.
Different methods, different questions, different theories. I did apply to MIT's Department of Psychology at the time. And I kind of agonized, went back and forth. I'm not even sure I made the right decision, but then they were very, as MIT was and still is. It's kind of like they asked me, well, do you think you'll be able to raise your own money to support yourself? I mean, that's the MIT way.
Yeah.
Whereas at Harvard, it was, we'll pay you full fare all the way. And I didn't have to think about that. When I went back to MIT as an assistant professor, I had to raise half my salary from grants. That's the MIT style.
The MIT way. Okay. I didn't have that dilemma because I applied to both Harvard and MIT, but I only got into MIT. And happily, they offered me money. In physics, physics is a richer field, so they tend to pay your way. But then, of course, it turned out I came with money from Canada, and they immediately deducted that amount from what they were offering me.
Same here.
Yeah,
no, I had a
INSERC.
It was now they call it an INSERC, but it was an NRC at the time.
This is just like
okay.
This is like, look at how smart we are.
Transition from visual cognition to language.
Well, I actually studied them both in grad school.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
My thesis was on the representation of three-dimensional space in mental images. When we imagine a scene that isn't physically present, like if our eyes are closed, do we imagine it from a particular vantage point, a particular perspective, or is it?
Yeah, this I don't like this style of interview because it kind of ignores the fact that there's an audience that would want to consume this. And like, isn't Pinker supposed to be on this guy's show to promote his book? They've spent 19 minutes of an hour or so interview just going over their own personal history. And it may just be something about me or whatever, but I find this personal story crap just insanely boring. And in this case, it's like self-congratulatory in a lot of ways.
Kind of in an object-centered coordinate system where there's no viewpoint, and I argue that there actually always is a viewpoint, so that mental 3D space is actually more like what David Marr called 2.5 dimensional
space. I was going to say I read about 2.5 dimensional, and I was intrigued by that.
What the hell does that mean? It's a bit of a whimsical term.
Yeah.
The idea is that this is a kind of a matrix or a graphic representation where the horizontal and vertical dimensions are represented by, basically by different cells, different entries, but depth is represented by a quantity. So it's not like we have three-dimensional voxels, like a kind of mental sandbox, but rather we have what we see is always a set of surfaces, and we are aware of how far away they are and at what orientation. But it is not like a like molding clay. Anyway, that was the thesis. But at the same time, I wrote a theoretical paper when I was in grad school on language acquisition, where I kind of worked my way into a conclusion similar to Chomsky's, but coming from a very different direction. You know Chomsky well. You've interviewed him a number of times.
Yeah.
The thing is, he's a totally brilliant, seminal thinker, but he tends to be treated as a kind of a guru. He is almost a cult figure. He's got his a theory that's kind of idiosyncratic and personal, and it's his vision. And I was never part of that cult, but I did kind of
You were part of a slightly different cult, sir.
Surprise, kind of wandered into a similar conclusion just by looking at AI and mathematical models of language acquisition. That is, so studying how kids learn language was a thing at Harvard when I was a grad student. But I always thought all the discussion was very squishy. It was just like they wrote down baby talk, and is it an active process? Is it a passive process? And I wanted a little more rigor. So I dove into algorithms for learning language. That is, imagine and this was a very Chomskyan conception. He called it a LAD, language acquisition device. So the idea, the input to this box is sentences drawn from any of the world's 6,000 languages. And that would correspond to what you hear your parents and siblings say when you're a little baby. The output is Chomsky would call it a grammar, but we can think of it as an algorithm for understanding and producing. And so the question is, what's in that box? How do you go from a few million sentences that you hear from your parents to a generative algorithm for speaking and hearing for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at those the models that were around at the time, the AI models, the ones that actually worked had to have something built in as to an overall expectation as to how language works. What's the basic computational architecture? What are the basic units? Obviously, you couldn't build in, English or Japanese, but the ones that tried to do it just as a blank slate were hopeless. And the ones that at least had some priors, you could put in priors, were much more successful. So I realized, that's kind of a roundabout way to coming to innateness.
Yeah,
that is, they are priors in a learning algorithm.
So they're hardwired priors instead of software.
If I would have known what this was, I would have picked something else for the show today. We'll suffer through it though.
And so this
podcast metrics will be bad on this one.
The reason I'm bringing it up is I think it's relevant to the rationality issue that I as I say, that I was fascinated by in your book, and I have 60 questions which I've pared down to 8 or 10 or 12, and we'll see. But this innateness is interesting to me because where I see, I'm not an expert, of course, but the difference, having spent time with Chomsky and listening to you, is that both agree that there's some innate capability for language, which is an essential part of being human. But Chomsky surprised me when I first heard him say this, is that his argument is that language was more useful for thinking, not than communicating. And from what I gather is you're more of the viewpoint, which seemed rational to me in advance, that language was developed for an evolutionary basis for communication. Could you comment on that distinction between those two for me? I've actually never understood that claim. It just seems
patently false based on some of the basic design features of language, such as there are words. Now, why would you have to learn for every concept a word with a pronunciation if it was all in your head?
Well, I think he argued that the ability to create an infinite number of sentences expanded your ability to be conscious in a sense. And
I'm all for that. That would be a explanation for why thought is combinatorial.
Okay.
If we're talking about language, why do you need stretches of sound for every concept? Why do you need the whole component of language called phonology, namely the mapping of?
So, I could take a stab at this. If you have a concept of a tree and then you name it something, it might be easier cognitively. Like it might reduce your cognitive load to have a name for it. When you think about the tree, it's not that hard to I don't think that what I'm saying is crazy. Like if you don't have a name for something, it's hard to think about it. It's hard to think about it on any kind of deep level. That's why language is important to thought, is because it gives you a fucking name when you're like, oh, that thing with all the leaves. Oh, you don't have leaves even. You don't even have the word thing. Like, how do you even think about a thing? Like, yeah, that language is good. It reduces the cognitive load. It must when you're just thinking about anything.
Sentences onto articulatory commands when you speak and acoustic signals when you hear. If it was all going on in the head, you wouldn't need that.
But it makes it easier.
That would not be an essential part of language. It'd be an internal medium of communication, like a programming language. And you don't have to pronounce. You don't have to.
It is like a programming language. He's like almost there. Because like a programming language, right, is like basically an abstraction layer. Because by the time something hits the computer chip, just to be overly simple, it's hitting that as binary. But the layer above that is a programming language that makes it easier for someone to tell the computer what to do. And I think that that's pretty analogous to when you think in words. It's like an abstraction layer over the concepts you're thinking about that makes it easier for you to think about and like work through the concepts in your mind.
Machine code in a computer is not pronounceable. It doesn't have to be. It'd be a total waste to convert it to and from acoustic signals. Also, you wouldn't need the rules of phonology, a whole component of grammar which Chomsky himself helped to define back in the 1960s, namely all of the little adjustments that we make when we speak that go into an accent, the slurring of adjacent sounds. Now, these obviously aid articulation, but the fact that you articulate, it would be a massive coincidence if an inherent part of language was getting it out of the head in an acoustic signal that other people just happen to be able to hear, if language wasn't designed for communication. Now, of course, I agree that there is...
and I think maybe people think differently, too, because I'm pretty sure that I think in words. I don't think in a lot of abstract concepts or pictures or whatever. Like when I'm thinking about something, I can almost hear myself talking to myself in my head. So I think maybe it's different for different people. And it may depend on how you were educated. It might depend what language you speak. There may be certain languages that lend themselves more to thinking in words, whereas other languages lend themselves to like thinking in pictures or concepts or whatever. I'm just kind of fucking spitballing here, right? I don't have a background in any of this stuff. So
part of it might depend on what you call language and meaning. That is, Chomsky might call it logical form. That is the content of sentences, the gist, the actual, what synonyms have in common. That obviously is what we think in. And but as long as you distinguish that from, say, Japanese or Yiddish or Swedish or Yoruba, that it seems to me that the common sense view, what anyone would say when you say, well, gee, so and so on the street, why do we have language? Well, to communicate. Okay, and they're right. Of course, you have it to communicate.
Yeah, it certainly helps.
Yeah,
but I've often wondered. I mean, I think it's hard to know whether you can think without language, I guess, is the key question.
Oh, you can definitely think without language.
You do when you think you don't internalize words?
Well, you have snatches. You use stretches of sound as short-term memory.
You just said snatches.
But you don't think in complete sentences. Thought would be way slower. If you did, also writing would not be a slog. It would just be output.
Yeah,
kind of struggling for what words actually express my thought. We've got going back to my thesis. We've got imagery. We think we mentally rotate a cube or a stick figure. We're not describing it in words the whole time. Kids have to acquire language in the first place, and if they couldn't think without language, how could they learn language? So we know that from studies of non-human animals, that animals can solve problems, they can recognize things.
They can
build
technology.
Language makes exponentiates the power of thought, not only because it allows us to share thoughts with other people and to think thoughts that would never have occurred to us on our own, but we can also use it, the sort of auditory and articulatory images of stretches of sound, as a kind of scratch pad to hold ideas while we're working through them.
Okay, well, look, that's fascinating, and I want to spend the last half of this on more directed to the book in a sense. But I have to ask you one last question, just out of curiosity. When I was at Harvard, my favorite guy in the Society Fellows was David. He won the Nobel Prize for figuring out how cats see. Was he in psychology?
David who?
I'm trying to remember his last name now.
Hubel.
David Hubel. He was also Canadian.
He's also from Montreal. David Hubel. He's at the medical school.
Oh, he's the medical. Did you interact with him at all when you were doing your cognitive, your vision aspect?
I'd love to ask you about your book, but let's name drop some more.
Oh, okay.
Every psychology student learns about the work of David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel.
Yeah.
Just absolutely fundamental. Basically, it was, and to this day, I show my intro psych class his original film in which he made the discovery of the line detectors in the visual brain of the cat.
Yeah, the cat.
It's an amazing little video. At least I think it's amazing. The students, I think they're amused that I find it so gripping. I've seen it like 50 times, and I find it
That's the only thing I agree on with Pinker on. I like cat videos too.
That's great. Well, as long as you convey your enthusiasm, to me, that's a large part of teaching. So,
Yeah.
because if they don't understand why you're interested, why would they be interested? Okay, but this rules, the fact that there are rules for language, and you know, I was thinking about your movement in writing, from writing about language to eventually writing about enlightenment, the better angels of our nature, and then enlightenment now, was a move in some sense to try and ultimately come to what I would say is rationality, which was what surprised me about your book. I picked it up and I thought, okay, this is going to be another Steve Pinker book explaining why rationality is necessary, but also why historically the world's getting better, and a social. And instead, to my great pleasure, in a sense, because I would have bought into that, but instead, it's a discussion, or rather detailed discussions of rationality and cognition and the rules by which rationality is acquired or abused in humans. And in that sense, it was such a unexpected pleasure to read and learning experience. So let me just say that for those who may wonder what this is, it's quite, it's much more psychological than I would think. I tend to think of the better of enlightenment now and better angels of our nature as trying to promote a worldview that may go against the grain, but is important. But this is an exploration of an.
So his first two books were basically telling people who wanted social progress to shut the fuck up, because it's never been better to be alive. And I mean, to some extent, sure, we have the internet. More people have a TV. Just like kind of Fox Newsy talking points. Oh, you have a refrigerator. Well, they didn't have a refrigerator 100 years ago. So you should be thankful. That's sort of like the angle of the books that they're talking about right now. And like obviously just based on the way I'm talking about it, I don't share that view. I don't think that that's like really a kind of a good framing for how to look at the world and how to think about social progress or even technological progress. So I'm kind of glad he got off of that shtick, but I've heard him talk about this book a couple times, and every time he's talked about it, it's been about this insufferable, just in completely different ways.
Of something that is interesting to define, and I want to begin with your definition, which, well, you have a variety of them, and I want to come back to it because it seems to me there's a circle in the book where you sort of begin and end. But what surprised me was, in some sense, you say that rationality is what allows you to get things you want. And that's not what I would have. I mean, there's a wonderful definition of it at the end of the book that we'll get to, maybe, if we get to it.
If you ever get to it, yeah.
I wonder if you could elaborate, because it seems to me sometimes irrationality also gets you what you want, and emotion sometimes gets what you want.
Well, it's the way I put it is irrationality. I don't think irrationality does get you what you want, although what you want could be irrational.
Yeah. I mean, that's
fucking stupid. This is fucking stupid. You can get what you want all kind of different ways. I actually agree with fucking the friend of Epstein on the right here, is that you can use appeals to emotion to get what you want. You can use, in some cases, violence. People use violence to get what they want. And I would suggest maybe those two things wouldn't fall under anybody's definition of rationality.
That's the key point. In fact, a large part of the latter part of your book is saying we are rational beings, but we're not ultimately. We're using rationality in a local sense, and it doesn't get us what we want globally.
Exactly. Yeah. So the definition is related to the famous statement of David Hume that reason must always be a slave to the passions.
Yes, which I was going to want to focus on later. Mm-hmm.
Which is easily misunderstood as saying, well, we have no choice but to splurge, to blow our stack, to
like get on a plane and go to an island,
to do whatever feels good. That's not what Hume meant when he said that. I think what he meant is that reason always is a means to an end. It's a way of getting something, but what that end is cannot itself be determined by reason. And the one way to think about it is if you kind of try to imagine what reason without a goal might be. You might say, well, gee, why isn't just using logic to deduce new true propositions from old propositions? Isn't that rationality? Well, just imagine someone that simply spun out, using the rules of logic, just spun out a bunch of true statements till the end of time. And they were strictly true logically, like if 1 and 1 equals 3, then pigs can fly. Well, that is true by they're both false. And,
Wait, what?
If then statement is only false if the premise is true and the conclusion is false. So you can then say, oh yes, and if if 2 and 2 is 7, then pigs can fly. If 2 and 2 is 8, then pigs can fly. Till the end of the time. So you're just saying true statements forever, and you're totally logical. Well, is that rational? I mean, no. We say no. That's not, whatever rationality is, it's not that. It's not just saying true things.
Yeah.
We call it. I think we call it rational when there is some goal that we accomplish. I use the wonderful passage from William James, the philosopher and psychologist and namesake of the building that I work in at Harvard, William James Hall, where he said
I just can't get over like how this is supposed to be some kind of galaxy brain smart shit that if like the premise of what you're saying is false, then going through a logical tree or whatever based on a false premise, sure, I guess the logical tree works, but then it's fuck bullshit because the premise is false. Like why would you waste time telling someone that? Like I don't understand. Like
we tried to contrast a rational entity from a not rational entity. And he said, Romeo and Juliet, Romeo wants Juliet as the filings want the magnet. And if no obstacles intervene, he approaches her by as straight a path as they. But Romeo and Juliet, if a wall is built between them, don't press their faces against the opposite sides, idiotically, like the filings and magnet with a card. Romeo finds a way of getting over the wall or around the wall. The difference is that with a purely physical process, a non-rational process, the trajectory is fixed, and whether it reaches an end just depends on accidents, on whether things are arranged right. With a rational agent, the end is fixed, and the actual trajectories can be varied indefinitely. So that, I think, is a good characterization of intuitively what we mean by rationality. But you're right that it opens the door to using rational means to some indefensible ends. And I think a lot of public rationality that concerns us so much today, why is there so much fake news and conspiracy theories, is that people can want certain goals like fortifying their side in a great, in the culture war and making the other side look foolish and their side look wise and noble. That's a goal. It's a dubious goal, but it is a goal.
But it's one of the things Steven Pinker does. He's describing a thing that I think he does.
People can be perfectly rational in attaining that goal, or the goal could be to achieve status as a fearless warrior for your side in the great culture war. And
that's a thing that Steven Pinker does. He wrote something about, I refuse to be canceled, when he said some dumb fucking shit. Or maybe the refusal to be canceled was about Epstein. I forget what it was. But, oh no, they tried to, like, some linguistics society, like, people were trying to get him removed from the board or something. And he's like, I refuse to be canceled. And doing that is, like, an attempt to be a fearless warrior for your side of the culture war.
So people will say, yeah, go Steve. He really stuck it to the conservatives or stuck it to the liberals. That's a goal. If everyone pursues that goal, we're all worse off. But people can be, unfortunately, pretty clever in attaining those goals.
Yeah, no, and that is a central premise, the last part of the book, which I do want to get to. Actually,
how many times has the fucking Lawrence Krauss said, well, that's an interesting thing about your book, which I do want to get to, and then just went off and fucking talked about something else?
Actually, in the preface of your book, you make that distinction between logic and rationality, which was fascinating to me when I first made it. And you exactly that's something to be logical but not rational. And in fact, the beginning of your book, you talk about classical logic, just so we can be clear on what classical logic is, because classical logic can be a component of rationality, but it's not the equal of rationality. And I mean, if you're illogical, it's hard to be rational.
Right.
I think that, so the converse is the way of proving the in fact, as you might have said in one of your chapters, that's the case.
The law of contraposition, right?
Yeah.
But yes, the reason that logic can be irrational is that when you apply logic, you may only appeal to what is stated in the premises. And the goal is to deduce conclusions that are true if the premises are true. But you've got to forget everything you know in order to do that. And in everyday life, even in science, it's never rational to set aside everything you know. Well, actually, sometimes it is.
Sometimes
not in everyday life.
Yeah.
So I mean, an example is, all plant products are healthful. Tobacco is a plant product, therefore tobacco is healthful.
Yeah.
So that's that is a sound inference. It's not valid because, in fact, not all plants are healthful. And we know what tobacco is, so we know to reject it. But if you were a logician, you'd have to say, yes, that is a valid inference.
But they're not saying any.
Let me connect. I'm jumping around.
Like if you start with bullshit and then you build a fucking tower of other bullshit, you build a tower on top of the bullshit, then the thing at the bottom that you built the tower on is still bullshit. Yeah. I mean, that's like, I don't know how that's like insightful.
I know we're never going to get in a logical order. Where do I want to get? But
well, you're never going to get to anything because you're not really.
That's true. But then
doing anything here.
Conditional probability, which is so important, as you point out that later, well, after describing Bayesian statistics very well, point out that people are Bayesian, but as I said earlier, they take a prior, which doesn't correspond to reality. It corresponds to the reality they want. Isn't that very similar in some sense to an abuse of logic? In some sense, the conditional probability is really, you're being irrational in the same sense while being logical, you're being irrational because.
Yeah, he just said that, like that statement that they're making, this is like the fourth or fifth time that one or the other of them has said the same fucking thing.
It's the problem with the statement about plants and tobacco.
Exactly. I think that is exactly right. It's just the probabilistic equivalent of what we were just saying about logic. And
hey, just say it again. Just repeat it back to each other a couple more times. It's fucking riveting.
Probability is related to logic, in that a lot of inferences in logic have a counterpart in probability. If you switch from things are just true or false to the kind of Bayesian conception that you have degrees of credence in a hypothesis. Yeah. So, for example, the fallacy of affirming the consequent in logic, namely P implies Q, Q therefore P. We know that's invalid. If you're a heroin addict, you smoked marijuana. Therefore, if you smoke marijuana, you'll be a heroin addict.
Yeah.
So that's the fallacy.
How is this some kind of intellectual discussion?
Corresponding fallacy is confusing conditional probabilities. That is,
if somebody started talking to me about this shit at a cocktail party, I'd assume they were an idiot. I assume a lot of people are idiots, though. That's like maybe my personal failing is that I just assume like people are full of shit. It's like as soon as somebody like endeavors to sound smart, to most regular ass people, they just seem like an idiot.
Probability of B given A.
But the conditional probability is a lot like if then, but a probabilistic version of if then. What's the probability of if that then occurs in some sense? So instead of being a rigid if then, it's kind of a probabilistic if then. Is I guess is a way of
exactly. It's almost like it's not exactly the same as what they call fuzzy logic.
Yeah,
but it's related.
Yeah. Before we get on to there, I'm going to skip a lot.
Before we move on, shut the fuck up. This guy keeps saying before we talk about the next thing, and then are they going to go back to the same fucking thing again? If they go back to the same fucking thing again, I'm cutting the podcast short, and we're going to get into the post game.
Your book, but your book is structured into sort of here are the components of rationality. Let me understand them. And then the last part of the book is kind of what I thought that, you had to address. As you say, this is the part you've been waiting for, because you think this is what people are going to look for, is why are we not rational, and sort of the more sociological perspective of how this is implemented in the real world or abused. And for that part of the book, I kept coming up with reason is the slave of the passions. Ultimately, the reason we appear to be irrational, and you're the eternal optimist, I guess, in a way, as saying it's not that we're inherently irrational. It's just that we're rational rational by being a slave to a passion, which may not produce a global rationality, but rather a local.
Fuck, they're going back to the beginning. We're done. I can't take it anymore.
Ultimately best for
I've been
everyone.
doing this. I'm sorry, everybody. Maybe I had a long fucking day or something. I'm fighting with this computer today. I just can't do it anymore. They just went right back to the fucking beginning again. They went right back to 10 minutes ago again. Watch the rest of this if you fucking want to. We're at 41 minutes and 17 seconds. If you want to watch them fucking go back in a couple more circles, you go right ahead. Thanks for listening to the podcast version of the show, everyone. This has been the shortest episode of the Intellectual Dollar Tree ever. In the post game, I'll probably publish the part of the post game on the podcast feed too, because somebody found something amazing for me. I'll let everybody know what's going to be the first thing in the post game. Somebody found a Clubhouse discussion of Eric Weinstein and Brian Keating whining that nobody believes that Eric Weinstein is unified physics, and I probably should have just run that for the fucking podcast. You can support this project, although after listening to this shit, I don't know why you would, at patreon.com/Echoplex, and you can follow us on Twitch, twitch.tv/Echoplex Media. This was so bad, I'm not even going to play Boomers. Let's see, what are we going to play here? We'll play, I don't know, I just feel like everything's, we'll just do something different. Let's do, here, in honor of their friend Jeffrey Epstein and other people like Jeffrey Epstein, put a napkin over your drink. It's time for the Huxtable.
Come Your mind plays